So now we're broadcasting. So what I'm going to do.
Hi there.
Oh, hi, Lee. Great. And now we have everyone. I was getting a little bit worried. I was going to go into the waiting room and get you.
I just logged out and logged back in again. So
Okay. So I see we have quite a few participants now. I'm going to start recording. Actually, I think we're already in recording mode. Awesome. Well, hi, everyone. For those of you who have not talked to me before, my name is Yan, and I'm Engagement Manager from ADL Ventures. We are a power connector for the Perovskite Solar Prize. This is the second series of our webinar series on Perovskite solar cell development and commercialization. I think about a couple months ago, we had a webinar on the topic of how to prove out long-term reliability for thin-film solars. And today we're going to broaden that topic a little bit more and talk about development and validation of commercialization plan and tech to market strategy for Perovskite solar startups. Thank you for tuning in for this conversation. Okay. So today's agenda, we're going to spend about 10 minutes talking about some of the updates from the prize and have me introduce the speakers. And then two of our speakers will spend about half an hour providing a webinar on development and validation of perovskite solar cell tech to market strategies. After that, I'm going to invite additional speaker to join us during the panel session to discuss about their experience with solar commercialization and tech to market. And after that, we will open up to the audience for Q&A, but you don't have to wait until the end to put in your questions. Anytime you feel like you have a question regarding to the webinar content or the panel discussion, feel free to just drop that into the Q&A section. So with that, I am going to pass it on to Rebecca Bennett, who is the project lead of the Perovskite Solar Prize from NREL. And she's gonna give a quick overview of the prize and some of the recent updates.
Thanks, Yan. And yep, I'll be really fast so we can spend as much time with our speakers and panelists. So the Perovskite Startup Prize, this is a 2-contest prize. The first contest is the countdown contest. And in the countdown contest, competitors work to build a team, develop technical and business goals, and secure access to equipment and labs with the opportunity to win a $200,000 cash prize and go on to compete in the liftoff contest. We anticipate awarding 6 to 9 companies in the countdown contest. So far, we have only had 1 countdown contest winner. For the liftoff contest, winners will go from the countdown contest, will go on to demonstrate the progress they've made, validate their technology, and solidify a network of mentors and partners with the goal of winning $500,000 cash and a $100,000 voucher to spend at an eligible facility, which could be a national lab or another private facility within the American-made network. We anticipate awarding between 2 to 3 companies in the liftoff contest. And the liftoff contest is open right now, but only to 1 eligible team, that 1 countdown contest winner. Next slide. All right, so if you are interested and you haven't already done so, we highly encourage you to read the official rules of the American-made Perovskite Startup Prize. They are available online, either at that link there. I will post the link in the chat. You can also find it at our HeroX page. I do want to note we did release a new version of the rules on March 11th. We are going into the 2nd deadline, the 5th deadline of the countdown contest, where these rules will apply. In those rules, we made a clarification on what happens to the liftoff contest when we delay application deadlines. We made a change to the program goal requirements to reflect terrestrial power market applications, which is a focus of CEDO. and a new requirement for the mentor engagement output in the countdown contest application for resubmission applicants. Please read the full rules for more on this, and if you have any questions, you can always email us. Next slide. And then I want to talk about the mentor network. So this is a unique network of individuals who are there to assist you with your submissions. So these are individuals with skills, expertise, or past relevant experience who can coach or advise competitors as they build their business. We do have a mentor introduction video that can give you a good idea of who the mentors are within our network. And we actually have 2 of them today on our panelist panel. So you'll get to meet 2 of them. And this we do this so that you can improve your submissions. When you receive feedback from one countdown contest, you can reach out to the mentors and they can help you with your submissions and help figure out how you can adjust various things within your submission materials, improve on your technical or business side of things for your submission so that you can progress for the next countdown contest deadline. And next slide. So important dates. Right now, I do encourage all of you to work on prepping your materials, specifically to reach out to Yan and ADL Ventures for application assistance. And she will also be able to assist you in connecting with that mentor network. And then our next deadline for the 5th submission deadline of the countdown contest is July 28th. So we're a little more than a month away from that deadline. Submissions are due at 5 p.m. Eastern Time sharp. And with that, Yan, I'll pass it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Rebecca. So now I'm going to introduce our speakers for the day. Our first speaker, Chris Mcdonald, is an independent consultant for high-tech manufacturing industries. Chris has 35 years in high-tech engineering and manufacturing, mainly semiconductors and solar, serving clients like Intel, Samsung, Applied Materials, and the solar startup companies. His expertise are all areas of high-tech factory operations, including factory setup, strategy, consulting, technology transfer, and run both domestic and international factory operation. And our second speaker of the day is Frank Yan, who is a partner at ADL Ventures. Frank is also the founder and CEO of Advantageous, an advanced insulation material startup. Frank previously spent more than 10 years in the solar industry as the co-founder of Scion, a US solar panel manufacturer and system integrator. He ran all commercial operation for the company, raising more than 500 million in funding and selling out a 150 megawatt annual capacity production line. And our last speaker of the day, Lee Feliciano, who is a COO of New Use Energy. Lee has worked in the residential, commercial, industrial, and utility scale segments of the solar industry, with companies ranging from startups to some of the largest solar manufacturers from Asia and Europe. Lee's personal interest in developing new business models and products resulted in the first solar project in Arizona financed through a PPA. He went on to work with Kyocera Solar and Advantageous, developing each company's first North America solar projects. In 2019, Lee helped launch Rent Solar, a mobile solar energy as a service business, which merged with New Use Energy in 2021. Okay, so with that being said, I'm going to transition into the webinar session of today. And our first speaker is Chris Mcdonald, who's going to talk about how to choose a competitive tech-to-market strategy for your Perovskite startup.
Can everybody see the screen?
Yeah, looks great.
Right, so what I have here is a PowerPoint deck for a 2 to 3 hour workshop. So I'm just going to touch on a few of the key points from that workshop. First of all, to say that everything depends on strategy. Having a good strategy you see some examples, companies that come from nowhere and have dominated their market segment. by having a good strategy, and equally others that have failed because they have not done so. It's a very simple in concept, just a general approach and 2 to 5 coordinated actions. It seems very simple, but it's amazingly important. And it's really having a detailed understanding of these case studies can reinforce that. Right. And so I talk through a process of how to get to a strategy, forming a team, getting the right people on it, analysis, options, decision-making, and implementation. So there is always a strategy, whether you know it or not. It might come from a formal process with lots of people involved, or it might be just something that emerged on its own due to various things that happen, reactions to market trends or programs from executives and so on. But most of the big successes are in what's called the dictated strategy, where the leader decides what should be done, with perhaps a few assistants, consultants, or strategic thinkers. And I talk about that, the pros and cons of the different approaches. Strategy has to start with analysis. Having a general approach is not enough. It has to be the right approach. And you can really only get the right approach from analysis. So I've got a few examples here. Understanding the strengths and weaknesses of your particular company, the opportunities and threats that you see out there. So for example, launching off on a particular strategy when it requires skills that your company is weak in, is not going to be a good outcome. So that's the first one, internal analysis. And then looking at the competition and supply chains. For example, it's a very different approach if you're starting to create a new invention nobody else has. If you're trying to enter into a market with strong incumbent players already there, it's a very different strategy, obviously. And then looking at some more external factors, political, technological, this one is very important for the perovskite, to have a very, very deep analysis of the technology. Where is it at? What are the grand challenges needed still? What's the plan to overcome those? What other technologies might be out there that could be just as good? The strategy has to be competitive, right? And kind of the guru of competitive strategy is a gentleman by the name of Michael Porter, Harvard Business School professor. And he says that you have to focus, right? Either you go after the low cost, you compete on low cost, and that's total cost, including quality factors and so on. Become a commodity supplier. Usually this is where the big volume is, right? That's competing in terms of cost. Or top left box, you can compete in terms of differentiation. That is, you come up with a product which is better somehow. In this case, it could be higher efficiency that people are prepared to pay a premium for because, for example, it might be a space constraint like a rooftop, right? Or it might be a low weight or flexible, although other people do that besides perovskite. And then third way is to compete in a particular segment, right? That's either a market segment. So you might say something like automotive or cell phone chargers, or you might be talking a particular kind of commercial application, but it's a particular segment that you can focus on. It has barriers of entry, but you can get behind it. So Or alternatively, you might go for a protected market. A particular country or region that has import tariffs and is committed to keeping those for the long term. So you might not have the lowest cost, but you have the lowest price because of market protection that you can afford. And if you try to do everything, you're stuck in the middle. And according to Porter and his decades of analysis, that means low profit margin and low growth. So once we've done this analysis of the market and the company and everything else, it's time to start looking at alternatives, right? And I just listed here a few of them that you might consider, right? So you might decide you want to be a fully integrated solar manufacturing company, right? The next SunPower, the next First Solar. Right? You might say, no, that's a bit too ambitious. I'm going to just make the cells. And either I become a supplier providing cells to manufacturers, or I outsource that. I keep my own brand. You might find a niche market that can leverage the unique capabilities of perovskite technology or protect the market. You might become an equipment or a solution provider. You might sell equipment, you might sell the material, the ink or whatever for making the perovskite. Or you might also make a plan to be acquired. This is very, very common in the semiconductor industry, where the big companies, semiconductor companies and equipment companies, is not where the fundamental new technology is developed. It's developed in startup companies. You get the know-how, to get the patents, to get the IP, and it's their plan all along at some point when it comes time to mass production that they will be acquired by another big company that has the deep pockets for investing in mass production. So all of these and others which you might come up with, they all have their specific challenges. Right? How to keep control of the company, how to control the IP, how to find suitable partners, suitable customers, the markets, all big and difficult challenges. And they all have a very different set of actions. All the way from the top one to build up an entire company and supply chain, or at the bottom is to focus on knowledge and IP and capability. So the idea would be now the team would look at these options and others, decide which ones made the most sense, were the most viable, where they could be the most competitive, where the challenges were doable. And flexibility is important because we never know everything in day one. Things happen. There may be difficulties along the way. There may be other companies emerging with a similar approach or an alternative. So it's important to kind of have checkpoints and then back up. So continually look at that strategy. Is it still the right one? Has anything changed? Including on the political and environmental factors too. Everything changed with the COVID, for example, or the war in Ukraine. So strategy has to be able to ride through events like that successfully or change direction. So it's complicated. There's a lot of choices, and I'll just leave a few conclusions here. That everything depends on strategy. Success depends on strategy. Without it, it's a gamble at most. And the strategy starts with analysis. And if I had time to step through some of those case studies with you, you would see exactly how that is true. It's important to put the right team of players in place to come up with the strategy. And this is usually not the line management team, whose expertise is in day-to-day operations. But it's people who can be strategic thinkers and can then drive change. Anyway, so this is available for any of the applicants. If you would like to contact me, we can have a workshop and we can go through this in more detail.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. So our next speaker, Frank Yan, will present on how to develop and validate a commercialization for perovskite solar startups.
Okay, thanks, Yan. So I'm going to share some slides as well.
Okay.
Can you guys see the slides okay?
Mm-hmm.
So Yan went through my background a little bit, so I'm going to jump right in. This is our agenda for my portion. We're going to talk about the key market dynamics and success factors behind launching a startup in thin film PV and trying to specifically apply some of that to perovskites. So if you look at the overall solar market, there's really never been a better time to be a US module or cell supplier or partner of some sort. Annual growth rate of 33% in installations over the last decade is actually unprecedented in any other form of power generation. And as most of you know, solar now accounts for the majority of new power generation brought online in the US. I think, as Chris noted, because of industrial policy and scale-up investments, most of these modules have come from China, but I do think a number of changes during the pandemic have potentially reopened a little bit of a window for US manufacturing. So certainly if you think about logistics delays, it used to take a month to ship modules from China. Now it could be 3 or 4 months or more, and that translates into lost money for developers and investors. And of course, you have various domestic trade cases as well as human rights concerns. And this is what's really led to a little bit of a resurgence of momentum, both on the government side with the drafting of some tax credit legislation, as well as you saw very recently yesterday, a group of large developers came out and made a large RFP, a large purchase request for US made modules, on the order of gigawatts of modules and billions of dollars. So I think that's a key trend, and it's certainly a positive for any aspiring players in the perovskite sector. I think nonetheless, there's, as Chris noted, a number of challenges that companies are going to have to work through to navigate this landscape, however promising. So we're going to now look at the perovskite landscape, and we're going to talk a little bit about perovskites and the solar industry and sort of some of the challenges and how this applies to the folks in the audience. Solar is really uniquely challenging industry because it's capital intensive, and you're really trying to make a commodity product that generates large scale power with the reliability of a defense product, because you've got a 25-year power warranty typically. So solar module is a semiconductor which sells for roughly the same price as a double pane window. And having worked in both the solar and in the building materials area, the double pane windows, insulation, all those things are actually not active components. So solar module is much, much more difficult to manufacture. So there are 2 perovskite companies globally today that have publicly disclosed they're in the pilot or the scale-up stage. There's Oxford PV in England, and then there's Cubic PV here in the US, based out of Boston. So one's been in business for 12 years, and then the other's been in business for 15 years. And they're both using various partnering mechanisms to try to offset the significant cost and time of getting to market. So I think, as Chris noted, we are in a silicon world, and we're in a silicon world that's dominated by China. I think these companies have acknowledged those realities and somewhat tried to work around them. And I think it's important to note particularly that Oxford PV had a co-development agreement with a major equipment vendor, while Cubic PV was actually the roll-up of 2 different technology platforms. And so both of them are looking to integrate perovskite cells into existing silicon module architecture. And so that may or may not be the way that some of you in the crowd ultimately go, but I think it's important to think about how you develop your product and how you go to market, because these are going to have huge implications on how much funding and time you may need. I do think that however you choose to navigate your own business, I think you can be almost certain that you're going to need development and go to market partners to make it work. So next slide, we're going to look at Oxford PV timelines, and then we're going to talk about timelines for companies and technologies such as the ones that you guys might be working on out of the prize. So if you look at Oxford PV as an example, it took them 6 years just to get to their first major technical partnership and 10 years to get to pilot production. So I think one thing I'll note about solar industry is it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. But I will also say that once you get some initial momentum, the barriers to entry for other players to come in are pretty high. And certainly today, there's an unprecedented amount of capital today going into clean tech related investments. So there's been almost a 5x increase just in the last 2 years on an annual basis. So the funding environment, couldn't be better. I think the challenge is going to be, as Chris alluded to in his talk, is how do you navigate those funding challenges and how do you end up with the right level of control and scale for your company relative to what you want to do. So I think, what does this mean for the aspiring perovskite entrepreneurs in this room? I think quite simply, you've got to be really clever and persistent about getting dollars and support from every source possible. I think if you think about the software world, it's really been a given in recent years that, hey, any good idea can get venture funding. But venture funding has been much more difficult to obtain in our space. And certainly both of the startups I've launched, it took well over a year to get any form of money in the door. And so I think whether it's working out of a university or otherwise bootstrapping, that's often the reality of ventures like this one. So it's getting that first piece of support, even though it's the smallest, that's often the most difficult, because you'll find that a lot of funding agencies and investors don't really like to risk being the first to jump in, not surprisingly. And then once you get that, follow-on R&D funding becomes a little easier to get, and scaling your company and your facility may also create opportunities to get other forms of assistance like economic development or relocation funds, headcount assistance for things like apprentices or interns or postdocs, and even incubation and testing support. So we're going to look here just at what I call an example timeline for a hypothetical US startup. So we're talking about the Perovskite Prize today. We really want to emphasize that that's a really important mechanism for getting up and running that's fairly time efficient and not very restrictive in nature compared to what else you may see. We're going to talk about various acceleration and incubation mechanisms, and we're also going to talk about the business and the technical milestones you really need to take the business to that next level, which may be larger scale grant funding, it may be investor funding, it may be strategic partners. I think all those things require some type of foundation to build on. So I've now been working with DOE in some form for virtually my entire career, and with the CETO folks for the last 16 years. So one thing I want to note is that the prizes like the Perovskite Prize and the American Made Solar Prize, these are pretty unique opportunity to get in the door, because I think the team here, Marcus, Rebecca, and others, has worked really hard to think about, okay, what's the type of non-dilutive funding that, like I said, is not restrictive or time consuming, like collaborative awards and grants that can just get your technology off the ground and help you turn what you're doing into a real business. So I think in many of your cases, this is exactly what you need. And this is what opens the door to various other acceleration and incubation opportunities. So one thing I'd say is, even as an experienced entrepreneur, whether it's companies I'm directly involved in or otherwise board member or advisor to, I'm always encouraging people to look at these routes to get their companies off the ground, because I think there's been no situation I've been in the clean tech industry where venture funding is easy and straightforward and cheap to raise. That's just the reality of the environment that we operate in. And I think it's also my experience that it's really only with these validation points, plus all the other things that investors look for in startups from other sectors, that a solar company really becomes viable at all for any meaningful level of angel or institutional investment. So of course, ADL Ventures is a power connector for these NREL prizes, and we're hired by NREL to assist you in developing your application and plan to win this type of prize funding. And also want to note that we can refer you to a nationwide network of other connectors in the NREL ecosystem who provide various forms of in-kind knowledge and support. I think don't hesitate to reach out and engage. I think those of you that have talked to Peter have probably heard him harp on this numerous times. That coming from our shoes as people that have done this before in the startup world, every free resource and support you can get, you got to treat like gold, because you just don't have a lot of these opportunities. So we're going to shift gears a little bit. So we're going to talk about, so in parallel for searching for that first dollar in, it's also critical to be thinking early and often about your value proposition on the product and technology level, as well as sort of extending that to your entire company and enterprise. So I think Chris's talk, hit a lot of really cool strategic points about the 5 forces and about positioning, which you can sort of research offline. But I think one thing I'll boil it down to is it really all starts with product market fit and trying to find customers and end users that are going to show interest earlier rather than later. On the screen here is an example analysis that ADL did for client in the building integrated PV space. We looked at key product characteristics they had developed. This was a project that came out of one of the top research universities in the world, and they had put quite a bit of prior work into it. And we tried to very carefully match that with the needs and the willingness to pay of customers. So I think it's really important to not only go out and talk to people, but really to systematically rate and rank various opportunities by market segment and product type. That type of quantification, I think, as Chris noted, is going to drive where you take your business and where you spend time in R&D, as well as where you spend time looking for money commercially in terms of the channel partners and investors and others that might actually take your business to the next level. Also, as you'll see on the next slide, there's an alphabet soup of market size terms that you're going to be expected to navigate as you talk to investors and strategic partners. I think they're really going to want to clearly know how big the opportunity is, as well as how you're going to prove it out. And I think this is really important because, like, in order to have a viable business and in order to get funding today, I think given some of the failures and sort of the first wave of solar companies that Chris talked about, it's really, really critical to get, whether it's a conditional purchase order, LOI, or an MOU, something from a partner basically saying that, hey, they're going to buy a certain product spec at a designated price point if you're able to manufacture it and meet other conditions. I think without that, fundamental foundation, and without that understanding of the market that you're seeing, here, I think it's very, very challenging to get any type of business off the ground in this sector. So the next thing we're going to talk about is, so you get any kind of indication of commercial interest along with sort of current and prior funding. Those are probably the most important elements of the story you're going to tell to somebody who's trying to give you money. But I think there are a few other supporting frameworks that are really equally critical. So of course, you want to talk about the problem you're trying to solve. Not only macro level things like US module shortages, but also micro level, like specific cost and performance advantages over crystalline PV, particularly when it comes to being in the field and sort of real life performance. That's really going to set the tone for all of your commercial discussions. And I think investors are going to ultimately make their decision based on whether you're offering vitamins or painkillers, as well as whether your painkiller is or isn't one that somebody else could easily replicate. So once you've established that core product or service value proposition behind your company, it's critical to go into more detail about how you can convert that into profit. So I think in no construction or infrastructure-based industry or market that I've ever been, can you actually assume that risk-averse incumbents are going to simply buy your technology based on cost and performance? There's a number of delicate tactics related to market entry. And I think just as importantly, how you do that without spending so much time and money that you erode all your capital and all your profit margin from your production activities, that's sort of going to be the key to whether you have a viable business or not. So examples of this might be whether you sell a subcomponent to a silicon cell, or whether you private label your product versus going into a distribution channel. There's, as Chris noted, a risk return calculation and a calculation of how much control and ownership of your company you want to give up. I think every founder has to make his or her own decision around that balance. But I think whatever you do, you have to make sure you focus on being the best in the world at what you do and nothing else, while finding the right partners for the rest. I think resources and time are your biggest limitation. And I think investors see thousands and thousands of business plans and fund a very small portion of those. So I think that level of focus is just critically important to getting a business up and running, particularly in something as challenging as the solar sector. So the last thing we're going to hit on before we turn it over to question and answers is stakeholder engagement, and how we sort of use this to catalyze business development at a pre-product company. I think it's really important to know that most of the conversations you have early on, and perhaps all conversations, aren't going to directly lead to money. I think it's really important to build a holistic database of customers and users and other influencers, both positive and negative in your industry, so you can get the discovery and product validation you need for your story to stand with data and evidence. The other thing is I'd emphasize to treat each of these meetings like you're meeting with the president. I think you've got to be highly prepared, and you've also got to be very focused and brief. You'll notice I shared a link on the previous slide about pitch decks, talking about how the ideal pitch deck should actually only be 10 slides. Similarly, these market discovery conversations should be under 30 minutes, and in most cases, they should be more like 15 to 20. Engage the key experts, ask them to introduce you to more experts, particularly those that can make decisions that impact your business. And I think go through it, very efficient and in a very focused manner. You simply don't have time to do more as an entrepreneur. So certainly Yan and the rest of our team at ADL Ventures does this work often as part of what we call growth company scaffolding projects for emerging companies. These are often emerging companies like your own that need early commercial validation, but haven't put a full business team in place. So we really look forward to supporting you as part of the NREL Prize. And we also hope that many of you will grow into the next generation of US solar success stories, and we can collaborate more deeply. So we're excited to talk further here and take more of your questions. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Frank and Chris, for the very insightful content on Perovskite Solar tech to market strategies. Now I'm going to invite Lee to the virtual stage as well. We're going to have a panel discussion around how to scale up and commercialize Perovskite Solar technologies. Okay, so the first question I want to throw out to all the speakers is, what do you think is the most important form of commercial validation for scaling Perovskite Solar technologies?
Sorry, did you want me to get that? I wasn't sure if it was addressed to everyone or to me.
It's addressed to everyone, but if you would like to jump in, that would be great.
I'm sure I'll take a stab at it. So I think what both prior speakers have, made a point of is that there's many ways. You have to have a strategy, but there's many ways that you can achieve that strategy, and sometimes you even have to adjust right along the way. And so, Frank pointed out that solar is a commodity these days, right? And having had the opportunity to sit on both the sell side and the buy side for that technology in my career, I think it's important to understand that in a commodity market, it's price, right? It's all about price. And so as a new technology, that's your first big challenge, is being able to, have a roadmap to getting it to a price where it's competitive. And then the other aspect to that is, as Frank also pointed out, solar is a long-term product, and the people who actually finance the solar or will pay for it are risk averse. So they need some sort of assurance that, this new technology, this new product is going to be around that long. Now, that's the path towards getting into the solar commodity market. However, I think there are other ways that you can do it to enter the market, and you could address the scaling option later. And this is just my opinion, right? But there's a famous business book called Crossing the Chasm, where it talks about different stages, right, of entering the market. So number one, you have to pick your beachhead, right, or you have to pick your point of entry into the market, and that doesn't have to be a utility scale, point of entry or player or customer. I think in fact, I would argue that for most new technologies, you do need to start in a particular niche, right, where you can kind of play to your strengths. And I think there were some examples again in Frank's slide, right, where you capitalize on, it's whether it's the weight or flexibility, let's say associated with a perovskite module, or even, and this was an example of how SunPower entered the market, is the aesthetics, right, of having a product, because unfortunately, and I'm a big solar geek, so I love all kinds of solar, but there are a lot of people in that market that still believe solar is ugly, right? Like on the resi side. And so how do you create a product that's, aesthetically pleasing, right? And that is not necessarily in the commodity space, right? There are a lot of, high-end architectural companies, and this is more common in Europe, where, building integrated PV, is a segment of the market. It's a relatively small one, but if that's part of your strategy and you manage to that, and you have a plan whereby you can actually become, cash flow positive, or at least kind of get into the business as your first stage and target that niche, that doesn't have to be necessarily kind of, planning to come up with sort of a product that will compete on price, which is the bigger market.
Okay, that's great. I have a couple follow-on question on that. So Lee, you mentioned like investors in the space, a lot of them are risk averse. So for the startups, when they plan out their roadmap, are there any like product development milestone or operational milestone they should include in their planning to convince investor and strategic partners that they're a good fit for investment?
Yeah, so again, I'll refer to Frank's presentation where he talks about, having an LOI or MOU, whatever, just some sort of indication from the market or from a potential first customer that they would be willing to use your product. Now, again, having been on the buy side of this thing, I'll tell you that, a lot of it depends on personal relationships, right? Being able to secure that document. And I can almost guarantee you that document will have an out, right? For the potential customer. So they'll say, hey, yeah, we're willing to buy X amount of your product or use it for this project, provided you meet all these check boxes, right? So I think really the true test is, your first actual install, right? The LOI is a common step and a desirable one to secure, but it's not really until you actually have that product installed, operating in the field, in the real world, to me, that's the first real milestone you've achieved, right? Because again, if it's a new product and a new technology, not only do you want to get it out in the field as validation, but you immediately want to solicit, feedback, both in terms of how your product's performing, but also how the customer likes it and what they like and what they don't like about it. So to me, that's really the true test, right? Is getting in. And at that point, you can also, or you will discover whether there are any, major flaws or issues that you may not have anticipated with regards to your product, right? And also the flip side of that is that first installation may actually highlight opportunities that you hadn't considered before.
I would add that this is a question that needs very, very deep analysis and insight. And the answer depends a lot on the kind of product and the market that you're going into. Right? And you mentioned BIPV. The buyers there don't care so much about the efficiency, but they want to know what color is it going to be, and can they make it into crescent moon shapes or triangles or whatever, right? So I think you got to figure out your market first, and then really analyze who's going to invest in that market. And once you get in, what barriers are that protecting you against other entrants and so forth. So I don't think there's any substitute for really doing the real hard work and analysis.
Yeah, I agree with Chris, and I'll share that again, even as somebody that's had a lot of commercial and operating experience. When I started my most recent company, we probably went out and interviewed 30 or 40 buyers of insulation material before we really settled on a product path. And even after that happened, there have been lots of adjustments and updates since then. And like, I think there's an incredible amount of effort in terms of like developing a value proposition and a strategy that has to go into making a startup successful, because by rule, any entrepreneurial endeavor has like a 9 out of 10 or more chance of failure. Like I think in any type of clean tech related sector, you can probably multiply that several times. And that's just the reality. But I think if you look at Tesla and First Solar and some of these other success stories, I think that the market position you can develop as a winner is tremendous. So I think I talked a little bit in my slides about the importance of commercial validation. I would just say I 100% agree with Lee that you've got to be in the field and you've got to be performing, for it to really be a real business, because that's actually delivering value to the people that buy and finance these projects. Now, on the flip side, some of you guys may be looking at that and saying, hey, I'm 6-7 years away from even having like a, test site at NREL or something, fairly rudimentary. And I think that's where having these indications of, commercial support are really important. And I think my current startup, Leatris, we have funding from both the DOE benefit program as well as NSF SBIR program. And NSF, for their commercialization plans, will often use a term of what they call strong, letters of support. Because I think now there's, enough startups out there that, people know, hey, it's good to get like an LOI or some other type of conditional thing from somebody who wants your product. But I think really getting a strong and definitive indication from somebody that's credible in the industry is a lot different than, sending a form letter to, 10 people, that happen to operate in the same region or the same market you're in, and getting them to, sign like a 3-sentence thing. So I think the more definitive you can make your value proposition early on, with the appropriate caveats, knowing that all, large companies, have some type of approval they have to go through to do this type of thing. I think that's really important, because we're seeing some questions here in the chat about, hey, when's the right time to go out for funding? When's the right, type of milestone? I think you've got like a reasonably strong, support letter, LOI, or some other form of validation from a pretty well-respected, corporate or large scale buyer. That's going to take you a long way, and maybe even more so than any type of, technical milestone. But like, I wouldn't underestimate the work that would, go into that, because even for like non-binding support letters, there have been cases where I've had to go up to like the corporate communications department of like a 10 or $20 billion company and navigate 3, 4, 5 months worth of, approvals. Like, it's not rocket science to do that. It's just, I think, a lot of persistence and work. So I think getting whatever level of validation you can for the stage you're at, I think is really, really important. But yeah, I think as these guys noted, it's no substitute for, doing the preparation and then ultimately getting the product into the field as well.
Yeah. That's kind of part of the general topic of credibility. And understanding that most investors don't actually understand the technology they're investing in, right? So it all comes down to, do they believe you, or do they believe other people they consult with? And, if you're a big, powerful corporation with deep pockets, you can make a lot of promises and people will go with you. But if you're a startup, they're not. So I think the example there that we saw from Frank with Oxford PV partnering with Meyer Burger, I think that kind of thing is a very smart move. You're now no longer just a small startup, but you're a partnership with someone with more credibility.
Yeah. Awesome. So I'm going to actually go back to what Lee was mentioning in his response. Lee, you mentioned like it's a good strategy to leverage beachhead market and use that to break into the broader market. In your opinion, are there any interesting niche or beachhead markets that Perovskite Solar should look at, and how that can be leveraged to help the company smoothly transition into a broader market adoption?
Sure. I guess I'll talk about it in a general sense and also in a specific example. So I think in a general sense, any new product, new technology, when you pick your point of entry, it often, perhaps almost always involves, finding those early adopters, right? And that's an essential step. But then to achieve long-term success, you have to figure out how to migrate from those early adopters into the mainstream, right? But those are two separate steps, and not to say you can't think about them in parallel, but you have to get to step one before you get to step two, right? And so, I'll give you an example, I guess a specific example, like in the case of my current company, which is an early stage company, we focus on mobile, rapidly deployable solar systems. So they're essentially solar plus storage, right? We replace generators. And so by nature of the application in our product, because they're mobile and they're deployed on often a temporary basis, what is valuable to us is weight and durability, right? Price is less of an issue because, in a disaster, which is kind of our core market, the highest and best use for energy is communications and lighting, right? And then, refrigeration. So those are things where people are willing to pay a premium for something that's light, that's durable, but it doesn't have to last 20 years, right? Our products are typically designed as 5 to 10 year products. So I'll stop, my shameless self-promotion right now, but I just want to give you that example where, if someone can give us a solar panel that's high efficiency, that's light and durable, even if it costs, and literally we are using panels right now that are 4 to 5x the cost of a regular crystalline module, right? A commodity crystalline module. But there's a market for those. So that's one example. The other one, which we talked about again, is BIPV, where, if you, I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of folks kind of in the green building, sustainable building side of things. And so, there is still a big movement. In fact, I'd say it's growing, for sustainable buildings, right? Buildings that are, zero carbon footprint or energy footprint. And so often those things are, let's face it, they're not cheap, right? The upfront capital cost is high. Although the argument there is that the lifetime, the operating cost becomes lower because of how they're designed, they're energy efficient. And so those types of projects and the people behind those projects may be more willing to absorb, that higher cost in exchange for, either the appearance or the flexibility of the product, right, relative to what they're trying to build.
Mm-hmm. And when you determine who is willing to pay a premium for a new solar technology, do you usually go out and actually talk to those potential end users and get their feedback, or is more of just based on general market insights?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's no substitute for, reports have a role, although what you'll find is if you're trying to introduce a new product to the market, using kind of third-party reports has limited value because the product doesn't really exist yet, right? You're using, maybe a similar product as an analog or a reference, but it's not an actual report on the market for your product, because your product doesn't exist. So there's no substitute, I think, for actually making those connections. But I think you also have to be careful about the fit, with the people you're talking to, right? Because there's also a tendency for a lot of companies, whether they're startups or sometimes even established ones, to chase the shiny objects, right? And hey, here's someone who's interested in me or my product, but it's not a fit, right? They want this, and this is not what we are. So like, how do we sort of contort ourselves to make it fit? And I think that's a mistake, right? I think it's better to kind of, cast the net wide and then filter until you find that potential first customer, early adopter, whose needs match the characteristics or the strength of your product.
Yeah. And that kind of highlight the importance, and Frank talked about like doing that matrix almost to determine what is the best product market fit and narrow down to a few applications and then start to conduct stakeholder engagement. And one question on kind of the broader market environment, Frank, you mentioned that the market has demonstrated growing demand for solar, but given the recent macroeconomic downturn that we have been observing, do you think that will affect solar market, especially new solar technology that like solar, perovskite solar, market entry and growth trajectory?
Yeah, I absolutely think it will, because like I think one reality is that we're talking here to a group of entrepreneurs that everything you do here to some extent is going to be in the first couple of years either investor funded or partner funded, right? Because I think government grants and other awards may get you part of the way there, but ultimately you need, again, some type of commercial scaling and validation to become a real company. And there is not a single company or investor that won't be affected in some way by the macroeconomic environment. I will say, this time around, it does seem that there's more, like I said, more funding going in the clean tech area. I think there are very limited number of ventures in this area that have been around for any amount of time, because I think back to when I started Beatrice in 2017, 18, especially following the last election, nobody was really dying to start a clean tech company, and certainly nobody was out there funding them. So I think there is like a good supply demand imbalance in terms of there's been a lot of funds raised that want to invest, but I think valuations are going to be lower, deals are going to take longer, and then that just hammers home the importance of, again, not only non-dilutive R&D funding, but like every form of free assistance or in-kind support you can find, whether it's from federal, state, local governments, it's from commercial development partners, financing things through vendors. I mean, I think there's sort of like a down market playbook for managing a business. You guys have probably seen a lot of articles recently on VCs instructing their portfolio companies on those types of things. So I think that there's many software companies out there where entrepreneurs probably never been through a down market because they didn't come out of school until after the last recession, and they've been in this sort of booming environment. I think a lot of us that have been in solar have actually seen like 3 or 4 of these, because there was 2008, 2009 recession. Then there was the Solyndra, I think, default on DOE loan guarantees, froze the fundraising environment for some time as well. And then certainly, like I said, 16, 17, the election, I think changed a lot of dynamics in the fundraising world as well. And so like, yeah, I think there's just all these things that you need to do to prepare yourself. And I think for those of you that are serious about starting companies and growing them, you should be doing every one of those things. So on the bright side, like I said, I do think it's a little bit more positive this time, particularly for solar companies, but everybody's going to get hit by it in some way.
Yeah, although Frank, I would argue that, yes, while it's true that, everyone's impacted by down economies, solar has continued to grow, right? Perhaps not as quickly, but I mean, it's pretty much continued to grow since, you and I first met and started the business. I don't know how long ago that was, but so I would say, particularly if you come up with a product that has a unique niche. Now, going back to what we were talking about in terms of, let's say a niche product that is more aesthetically pleasing, right? That would apply, say, to like a high-end building project. Perhaps something like that is more susceptible to economic downturns, right? Where people are sort of cutting back. But if your product happens to be, and I've talked to some perovskite startups that believe they have a roadmap to, driving the cost down significantly lower than silicon, right? Then that opens up all sorts of opportunities, right? For even, kind of entering into a niche market or segment of the market where, if your product is so low cost, maybe you can market it in a situation where it doesn't have to be a 30-year product, right? It could be a 10-year product, like I said, because the cost justifies it. Or, it could be something where it's low cost enough that you could offer, let's say, be part of that energy as a service niche, and part of your business model is you replace the product, right? Every 5 or 10 years. But the numbers make that work, right? So I think there are opportunities to grow and play in the market regardless of the economic circumstances.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we're going to transition into Q&A now. I'm going to see what questions are here. So I'm going to start with more of a question that relate to our panel discussion here right now. What are some financing options out there that Perovskite Solar startup can pursue? This actually relates to something we discussed yesterday.
I guess my question to that is financing in terms of raising capital or financing in terms of project financing? Could we get some clarity on that?
Yeah, and I guess maybe I can just asking kind of question from my angle is like, yesterday we talked about their like capital stack for solar startups. What can go into that capital stack? There's VC, there's non-dilutive. Are there any other financing options out there for Perovskite Solar startup to look at?
Yeah, so I would say that again, I think there's a immense amount of opportunity out there. There's a lot of pockets of money that a lot of people aren't even aware of. So I think every entrepreneur's default tends to be, hey, we're going to go out and raise VC, but that may often not actually be realistic at the stage that a lot of these perovskite entrepreneurs are at. So I think finding any type of R&D support, because of course your work in the beginning is largely technical, is going to be critical. So I think we're talking here about the prize. We're talking about DOE and other agencies having competitively bid grants. I think there are also opportunities, for example, to partner with universities, community colleges. So for example, in Maryland, we have a program called the MIPS grant, where you can partner with a university and they'll fund a postdoc, and a lot of other states have that as well. So you're really looking for any kind of whether it's cash or in-kind, non-dilutive technical support, I think is really, really important early on, because there's a big sort of branding effect that comes out of every single outside contract or other type of validation that you get. Takes you away from sort of the default option, right? Because the default option is in the beginning, you're either funding it yourself or with what people call the 3 Fs: friends, family, and fools. So I think getting, like I said, that first is what's going to trigger you to then get the second, the third, and the fourth, and hopefully they become progressively larger and more mature. So I think definitely finding any way possible, whether it's through university partnerships, grants, other things to fund your R&D, that's probably the most attainable and realistic option at the outset. And then that's going to sort of then help you get in the direction of having a more viable funding strategy at scale that it may include venture and strategic as well.
Yeah, that's great information. Skylar asked a great question here that kind of embed multiple questions in this. Could you give some advice on the type of early partnership that will be most advantageous for an early stage perovskite startup? I see the value in partnering with silicon companies, but don't think this is the correct path given the supply chain issues and the environmental impact of silicon. Perhaps roofing material companies or mobile deployment system companies like Lee's, solar development and installation firms?
Yeah, I would say probably more the former and less the latter, because when you talk about solar development and installation, again, you're kind of heading more in the direction of the commodity product and large scale deployments, whereas a building materials company, whether it's roofing or windows, and by the way, they're both of those exist, right? In terms of large companies that are in that space that are acting, I guess you could say, as angels for some startups. But yeah, I think those guys, and I would term them more strategics, are maybe a little more patient, as long as whoever's making that decision within the strategic has the vision, shares the vision, and has, expectations that are commensurate to where the company's at. So, is it a 3-year time frame? Is it a 5-year time frame? Is it a 10-year time frame? But I think as long as the expectations of that investor, that partner are aligned with the company and its capabilities, then that's the ideal fit.
Yeah, I agree. That's great. And Jonathan asked a more kind of a technical question. How many cell PV lines are coming online in America? Does any of the speaker know this answer?
Sorry, what was the question again?
How many cell PV lines are coming online? I guess you're probably asking like how many cell manufacturers are coming into the market in America. I think that probably warrant a quick Google search, which I can do after this webinar.
Yeah, I think that's a question for, there are numerous industry publications that sort of track that in terms of signed deals, because that's really the only way I think you can accurately measure that is announcements, right? A lot of companies will fly under the radar, so that's not public information. But I think I'm not sure what the objective or of the question was in terms of understanding market size. But I think as Frank said, like there hasn't been a better time. I agree with that. There hasn't been a better time in our generation to be in this space. And I would say that applies for energy storage too, which is a complement to PV.
Yeah. Okay, next question. Given the lifetime of perovskites are not proven to be on par with silicon or technology yet, what market should be a beachhead for perovskite? Relate to that one before, what technical requirements should perovskite fulfill to address such a beachhead market?
So yeah, happy to respond to that one. So it's a great question. And so I think to some extent, I already kind of addressed that by saying, examples where, you're looking for an application that uses it as let's say a 5 to 10 year product, right? Assuming that's the appropriate fit. Then, whether it's a mobile application, like we do, or it could even be, but again, you have to have the other pieces, right, that make sense, like a low cost and or high efficiency. Then it could even potentially be in situations like, you could do solar projects where you could find an investor to fund them, and it would be, instead of a 20-year PPA, which is like your typical commercial PPA, it could potentially be a 5 or 10-year PPA, right? And at that point, as long as the numbers make sense, then you would replace the product after that period of time. And by the way, that's happening anyway now with crystalline, right? There's this whole segment of the market where larger scale projects are being repowered, where the crystalline modules, which are say 10 years old, are still functional and still producing, but the investors have done the analysis and determined that it actually makes financial sense to repower that project and put in, replace those 200-watt modules with 400-watt modules. So even though the product is still functioning, the newer technology has caught up to the point where it makes sense to replace it.
Yeah, one thing that I would sort of add from my perspective, having tried to get emerging technologies into projects like the ones that Lee's financing, is that like not all panel sales and not all projects are the same, as Lee just noted, because like I think people tend to think about the industry in terms of like, hey, what's the average selling price or what's the typical PPA return the investor wants. But in reality, like every single deal is different. So I think as an emerging technology business developer, your job is, again, this is part of product market fit, is to find the financing profile project that, sort of fits your product. So I think you shouldn't assume that just because crystalline modules are warranted for 25 years, that every project out there actually requires 25 years. So a good example is that a lot of the first large scale thin film projects we did here in the US were with a utility on the East Coast. They were owning all these projects, on their corporate treasury balance sheet, and their corporate treasury really only looked at the first 7 years of the return profile. And so that sort of mitigates part of the need for this longer term reliability. I think the other thing is that anytime you have a project developer or owner that's using third-party lending, that's going to make it more complicated. So I think a developer that's going to own the project on their own balance sheet always going to be easier to deal with than one that has a third party involved. Because usually if there's a third party involved, like a bank, there's probably also a fourth party or fifth party involved, like an engineering firm or some other consultant that has to, sign off on it. So I think removing those layers of approval and then trying to find the right, return profile that matches your product, I think will allow a good, otherwise good perovskite product to get into the project finance market.
Awesome. So I think we have time for one more question. Our startup does not have our own facility at the moment. We have customers that want to purchase our product, but we do not have the means to produce it at the moment. Our customers have offered their equipment to manufacture our material. How would you navigate working with a customer to manufacture your materials while simultaneously protecting your company's own IP? Would you just advise against it? I feel, Frank, given your experience, you might be able to provide some insights on this.
Putting me on the spot. Now I'm happy to answer. So first of all, this is a multi-layer question that we can't cover in a minute. I definitely encourage you, Blake, to reach out to Yan and I offline, and we'll be happy to talk about it. But I think in general, the best way to approach this early on is that you're going to be making a product at small scale. It's not going to be economical. So you're going to really have to have a partner that's going to cover some of what are called your NRE or your non-recurring expenses. So we at Styon, did this with Taiwan Semiconductor, who's the largest semiconductor manufacturer in the world. But we also had, tried this approach with people in some of these other businesses like roofing and others. So pretty large incumbents that initially you've really early adopters. Somebody mentioned that Jeffrey Moore, it's really about trying to find people that are willing to slightly overpay for your product because they really need it down the road. And so I think trying to get some type of deal where you're getting your development expenses covered as part of that is probably, critical. And I think if it's sort of like a foundry or contract manufacturing relationship, I think the key probably just comes down to you being able to utilize the line independently, like with your personnel, rather than having them, run it for you. But then it often gets a lot trickier than that because there's, is commingling of IP or their process instructions or other things that have to be shared. So definitely would encourage a offline conversation on that because there's a lot of different layers of nuance that go into how to structure those agreements. But I think that my key takeaways would be try to control as much of that pilot or toll manufacturing as you can, and then try to get paid appropriately for it.
Yeah, the key on this one, like any joint venture, is have a really good contracts person with some legal background that can think through all the nuances and contingencies and the end game for this, right? So, for example, you might do something like have a separate company that just does the manufacturing, but doesn't have any engineers, and then you can be a service company that supports the manufacturing, something like that. That protects your IP and at the same time meets the needs of this customer. They want to get, I guess what they want is spend some money on R&D so that they can get a locked-in supplier down the road or something like that. All of that has to be thought through very, very carefully, and not just see it as just some quick money you can grab and get your foot in the door without thinking it all through.
Great. We're at time. I want to thank all of our speakers and also everyone who made the time to attend this webinar. I just dropped my email in the chat. If your question did not get answered in the session, please follow up with me, and I will get an answer back to you via email, where we can set up a one-on-one call separately. Well, thank you everyone, and have a great weekend.